Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Dan Nessel Show. I'm your host, Dan Nessel. So are you happy at work? Do you feel like you have had some experiences in your work life, maybe even your regular life, that you regret? Some things that you dwell on from time to time? Well, sometimes you need some self-awareness. You need some self-reflection. You have to do some self-exploration to figure it all out. And you know what? Today, my guest is an executive and career coach, a speaker and facilitator, and an author and a podcaster who helps answer these questions and much, much more. Really excited about this conversation. Please welcome host of the Work from the Inside Out podcast, Tammy Gooler Loeb. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, very good. I am just, I'm really excited about this conversation because we've met a couple of times now. Met these days means virtually, of course. We've had a couple of good Zooms. I was so fortunate to have been introduced to you a couple months back in the, let's say I think it was in the fall, like September, October time.
Yeah.
That first conversation, you talk to somebody, you hit it off right away. And I felt that way. And I'm just like, I think that we've got a lot to talk about here. So just for my listeners, before I hand you over the floor here, Tammy.
Okay.
So Tammy Gooler Loeb, a successful business coach, a career and leadership and executive coach with, a couple decades of experience under her belt there. And when we talked a lot about, like things happening in the workplace, trends among like career trends, things that turn people off and on in different directions, and why that might be happening to you, or how you feel about your purpose, how you feel about your mission, and so on. These great big questions that I really enjoyed talking with Tammy about. And I'm hoping that we can get into some of that during our conversation today, because I think you'll really enjoy the insight that Tammy has. But first, I'd like to ask Tammy to just introduce herself and, how'd you get here? How'd you get into coaching and to being into that field?
That's a big question, and I'm going to try to give you a succinct answer. I would say that from a very young age onward, I have always just wanted to help people.
Yeah.
I think I was as young as maybe 9 years old. And my father would take me with him he ran a camp in the summer. He was a school psychologist, and he ran a camp for kids who had developmental delays. Now, back then, the terminology was quite different, how they referred to these kids. A lot of these kids had Down syndrome. And he would take me with him sometimes, and I would meet all these kids who were at the camp, and they were just absolutely delightful. And I was just inspired by their spirit. And my dad would explain to me that they had certain kinds of struggles. And so from a young age onward, I learned a lot from his work and the way he worked with different kinds of kids who had different challenges. And from there on, I did a lot of volunteer work as a kid in a number of settings. My mother worked in a nursing home. I did volunteer work in the nursing home. And then when I was old enough to work for paid work, I worked in the nursing home for pay. But I always enjoyed helping people. So I started off after college in the mental health field. I was fascinated by things like schizophrenia and bipolar and all that cool stuff.
All the fun things.
I know. So I worked in the mental health field. Yeah. And I think I just always would dig deeper and try to understand causality of things. So I ended up in public policy after that because I wanted to know how these programs were funded that I had been working in. These were community mental health programs. So I ended up in the mayor's office in Boston and worked on human service and public health policy there. And that was also an eye-opening and enlightening experience because I got exposure to policy work. I also got exposure to politics. And so that was a few years of my life, and it was consuming, but exciting. It was also a little bit on the burnout side of things after a while. So I kept going, and I learned all about grant writing as a part of that work as well. So that led me into doing some fundraising for a few years. So I moved into the fundraising area, and that was a little bit more removed from helping people. But I still felt like I was helping people, but it wasn't enough. So fast forward till I was in my late 30s. And I heard about this thing called coaching.
Hmm.
And it intrigued me. And I was at a point where I was thinking, I think I might need another degree or some other credential. I need to get back to working directly with people. I already had an MBA. I had somewhere in the middle of those years, I had gone and gotten an MBA because I was interested in understanding how organizations could run better. So, curiosity was always a thread through everything I did.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I heard about this new field called life coaching, I pursued it and ended up in a certification program and took that program, and it was wonderful. I loved every minute of it and became a coach. And I was trained as a life coach. I don't practice life coaching. I don't work with people around specific personal issues, although I do think of people's careers as personal,
Of course,
because
yeah.
a big part of what I do is help people work on what's personally valuable and satisfying to them in their work. So I don't like to see, a lot of people think of their work and their personal life, and they like to separate it. And I understand the need for some boundaries. However, for example, I love my work so much. I don't feel a need to separate it out so clearly and so definitively as some people have the need to do. Now, that can get me into trouble sometimes, because sometimes my friends will say, I don't need to be coached right now. So sometimes I guess I go into coach mode when I don't need to. But for the most part, I do take kind of a whole life focus to the way I work with people. We talk about how someone's job might be affecting their home life. Because if you're not enjoying your work, usually you're going to go home at the end of the day grumpy.
Yeah.
So it's going to affect all those things. But for the most part, I started off really focusing on career coaching, and then over the years incorporated more executive coaching, which really ties in with things like leadership and workplace communication and workplace relationships, and also incorporated group facilitation and training and developing curriculum for different kinds of management and leadership development programs. So I've been doing all of that for the past 20 years. And then 2 years ago, I decided to start a podcast, and that's called Work from the Inside Out. And that is a weekly podcast. I've done about 110 episodes now, and that's a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm.
And so every week I put up a new episode, and it's an interview with somebody who shares their story of various career transitions. And so it's just a ton of fun. And then what's grown out of that is a book that I just finished writing the first draft of, which is sort of pulling out the major themes of what's come out of the podcast and some of the stories of the people that I've interviewed. So that's me in a nutshell.
Big nutshell. And now, I mean, you've covered on quite a bit. There's a lot to unpack there. We'll get to the book and some of the podcast stuff later, because, I mean, clearly this is one of the things that we have in common is this podcasting thing. And
Yeah.
I've only been doing it for, I don't know, 8 or 9 months now, not quite a year. And I feel like it's such an indelible part of my life now that I can't imagine not doing it.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of it's because of the joy of speaking with people like you and folks who can teach me something during the course of an hour and just have an engaging, intellectual, kind of hopefully intellectually stimulating conversation, or something that my listeners would give me a little bit of would have a little bit of enjoyment and fun with. And certainly I'll get some good feedback about it. But really, it's just my journey. It's part of my journey now, this whole podcasting thing, And you talk about transitions. It's just this whole year certainly has been one of transitions. In fact, I mean, we don't talk about politics on this podcast, and that's fine, but it is kind of worth noting that today is January 21st.
Yes.
And as we record this, so, this won't be aired for a couple months, but, it's a time of transition. So, as everybody knows, we now have a new president in the United States. And, take that as you will. It is a time of change, and it's an interesting time to be talking to somebody who is focused on change and focused on like how people evolve their careers or change their careers or find out what's important to them. And that's kind of where I wanted to go a little bit, Tammy, where you said you said something earlier as you were describing yourself. I wrote down a couple of words, like the word service kept coming to mind. You didn't say service specifically, you want to
Mhm.
help people.
Yeah.
But service seems to be the, the prime force for a lot of coaches
Mhm.
and even for a lot of just people in the way that we work with one another, the way that we help one another. And you said service, you said curiosity, causality. These are kind of some really interesting words that I want to kind of try to connect together.
Mm.
You know, how do you help people understand or be curious about their own careers? Or is that something that, you find to be one of the, elements that you do help people with?
I love that you asked that question because that is something that I do help people do, is to be curious about their careers. So, people will often come to me when they've reached some kind of a crossroad,
Mhm.
and they might be asking some of the right questions about where to go next, or they might come to me just simply saying, I'm really unhappy, or something just happened to me that made me unhappy. And so I think through the process of coaching, we open up their curiosity.
Yeah.
We start asking questions that they haven't even thought of. And that's a big part of what coaching can offer people, is to start asking the questions. And a lot of the questions I ask, the term that I use is that we call them powerful questions. And they're powerful because they provoke self-reflective kinds of thinking that get people taking a look at themselves in ways that they don't ordinarily day to day. That's the beauty of coaching too. And I'm not trying to be even a walking advertisement for
Yeah, of
coaching
course.
here. But the beauty of, a lot of people who come to me will have already tried, for example, to solve some of their challenges on their own, whether it's they're looking for a job or they're trying to improve something at work. And in the past, maybe they were able to deal with that on their own, but most people are not successful in a vacuum. And so having a thinking partner, which is how I like to
Mhm.
characterize myself as a coach, having that thinking partner, having somebody ask you those kind of reflective questions, it gives you a chance to almost take a step back, take a look in the mirror, and take a look at yourself in ways you can't possibly look at yourself if you're doing this all alone. So sometimes it's a matter of somebody else, like myself, simply asking you a question like, well, what would it look like if
Mhm.
you turned right or turned left? Tell me more about what you're saying right now. Just a simple couple of words. Tell me more.
Mhm.
Because sometimes when people just expand on their thinking about something or offering them a reframe of what they're talking about. So, for example, if somebody comes to me and they're really interested in, let's say, an area that might require them to get more training, but they might say, oh, I can't go back to school. I'm too old,
Yeah.
or it's too expensive. I might say, well, what's holding you back from that? What makes you say you're too old?
Yeah.
I had a cousin who went to law school at the age of 50, you know?
Mhm.
So I get people to kind of step back and say, well, so let's reframe that a little bit. What if you just went and took a course
Yeah.
and see what that's like? Let's back our way into that a little bit and see what that looks like, because clearly you're interested in something here. So, there's lots of different ways to help people look at things through different lenses and different ways. And it's not about me trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm not attached to the outcome.
Mhm.
I'm just helping them find their way through to something that might be more satisfying and meaningful for them.
Yeah. That whole what if question is so key.
Mhm.
I've heard it, I don't know, gazillion times. That's actually a number, gazillion times in my career, in my
Mhm.
life from various people. And so I ask myself the question a lot more these days. What if I went this way? What if I went that way? Um, if I wave a magic wand, what would it look like? I love that one too.
What would it look like if you waved a magic wand?
Yeah. And that sort of helps you, I think, explore that curiosity that I think everybody should have and everybody needs to have in their with their life and with their career. I mean, even if you're totally satisfied in your job and in your life, I mean, curiosity plays a major role. At least I would hope it would. It'd be extremely sad to me if somebody's living a life that they're not curious about anything. I know I'm sure
Well,
those people are there.
I share in that, and you say it would be. I can say that I have felt that sadness because I
Mhm.
encounter people all the time who don't take those steps to explore things. I know a lot of people who think that they have to leave things the way they are because they have bills to pay,
Yeah.
or they perceive that the responsibilities they have limit them. I can tell you just as many stories of people who have had the same kinds of responsibilities and probably even less money in the bank, who have managed to find more fulfilling ways to
Yeah.
spend their days. But it's, a lot of people just get trapped in the way that they think about things. I want to tell you a quick story.
Sure.
And this comes under the category of how we can trick ourselves with the kinds of assumptions or expectations that we create. So when I started my podcast, I had an expectation that I was going to interview a whole bunch of people who were going to tell me all about previous jobs that they had that they either hated or were terribly unhappy in, and how they found their way along this, interesting path of discovery to nirvana or some job that they ended up loving, and how instructive that was going to be for my listeners. And I know from my own experience that I had been through a number of jobs that, while they were rewarding in some ways, there were certain situations I was in the past that were definitely miserable for me.
Yeah.
So I thought I was going to find all these people to interview who were just as miserable as I had been at some point and had found their way to something they loved just like I had. And what has happened over the last 2 years is I have come across quite a few people, at least the people who seem to be interested in being interviewed on my podcast, who, as a rule, were not terribly miserable in their past jobs. They
Mhm.
just reached a point where they were ready for something else. And so it really dispelled this myth in my mind that there's all these super unhappy people out there. I think there are
Yeah.
still a number. I think there is data that shows that there's at least 65% of people out there are somewhat disengaged at work.
I could totally believe that. Totally believe that.
But being disengaged doesn't mean that you're out and out miserable and unhappy. You're just
Mhm.
you're not feeling the love, let's say.
Do you think the whole idea of being unhappy means different things to different people? So, you know, those folks who you've been interviewing for your podcast, for example, and they're talking about, you said that for the most part, it's not like they were miserable. They just came to points in their career where they just were ready to make a change.
Yeah.
Are they particularly self-aware, or do you find that to be more of a common a normal thing among people? You know, just to back this up a bit, I've had my share of times where I was downright out miserable, right?
Yeah.
Miserable in my career.
Yeah.
And some of my friends know what those times were, and I really wish that I had had somebody like you to talk to at the time, like a coach that I could talk to. There was even one point I used the employee assistance program, went
Mm-hmm.
for like legitimate psychology, like a
Mm-hmm.
psychologist help. First time in my life, maybe the last time in my, I don't know, maybe not the last time, but certainly the first time. And I was just miserable. But what I found is that the misery was coming primarily from me. Like it wasn't
Mm-hmm.
always, there were definitely factors at work that were
Mm-hmm.
not good for me,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
But it was almost my choice to be miserable or not. I just couldn't see it at the time.
Yeah. So you hit on something very important there, the whole notion of self-awareness. And I think a lot of people, the first place they look, well, there's two first places they look when they're unhappy. Oftentimes they will look outside themselves and see, find fault somewhere else. They don't like their boss, or they don't like something about the leadership of the organization, or something
Yeah.
along those lines. The other thing that a lot of people do, though, is they turn on themselves, and they're very hard on themselves, and they make themselves miserable. I think, though, when you do have a greater sense of self-awareness, you are able to kind of unpack that more and work through that. Now, some people who've done a lot of self-development work have some of the tools and skills to be able to do that, or if they're already in counseling, they're able to figure that out. So those are some of the ways that people get there. That's a key to really making good use of coaching, is to work with people who, if they're not already self-aware, they are willing to go there and work on that. And that's part of what I help people do, is develop that. I would say that some of the people I've interviewed express tremendous amounts of self-awareness, but a lot of it is 20/20 hindsight.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about them, we're taking a walk down memory lane and they're reflecting back. But many of them will say, if I had only known then, what I know now, things would have been different. But we would all probably say that, right?
Absolutely.
And then
Yeah.
some people do say, but I have no regrets. I have no regrets. I had one person I interviewed recently who said very, very clearly that for the better part of his career, he really made most of his decisions based on how much money he could make. And that was about it. And it wasn't till very recently that he started to make different kinds of decisions. But I would say that he was more the exception than the rule in terms of the way that people have navigated finding their way to something more fulfilling and enriching. And not to say that having the goal of making money is a bad thing, or that can't be something that's fulfilling. But I think there's something else that has to come along with that. It's not just about dollars and cents, that there's something else along with that kind of abundance that you're looking for.
Well, Daniel Pink talks about that. I think I've even talked about this on the podcast before, but love to talk about it again.
Yeah.
When all things being equal, right? I mean, assuming your financial needs are met, then you are not guided by financial needs in your career or in what you're doing. You're looking for three things. You're looking for mastery, autonomy, and purpose.
Yeah.
And by the way, I don't think I've ever completed a whole Daniel Pink book. I'm a notorious kind of skimmer, and there's just this amazing video I watched, I don't know, 10 years ago, maybe more. And this one stuck with me about this. And, assuming that your financial needs are met, are you achieving mastery at your role? Like, do you have the skills? Are you getting the skills that you want? Do you have autonomy? Are you trusted? Can you go out and do things that you want to do and be self-guided? And do you have purpose?
Yeah.
And purpose can be defined in a number of ways, but the jobs, when I look back at, and you said, people say I have no regrets. Having no regrets is a very, I think, convenient thing to say when you look at where you are now and you say, like, were it not for everything that happened before, I would not be where I am now.
Right.
And if you're in a place now where you where you feel pretty good about things, or on the whole, everything's going the right direction, then, you don't want to say I have regrets, because if you have a regret, it means maybe you wanted to be in a different place now. If you dig deep on that, peel away the layers.
Yeah.
But I certainly have a few regrets. I will tell you that, like, straight up, I have some regrets about some decisions I made, about jobs, about career moves. And I just don't let them weigh on me anymore, but they did weigh on me for a while.
Yeah. Well, I think that's very brave of you to admit that, and I wonder, but I think the key there is that you've also let them go. They're not weighing on you. And I think the key with regret is if you carry that with you and it weighs you down, right?
Yeah.
So you might have something that you regretted and it weighed you down for a while, but you're able to move on from it and still learn from it too. Yeah. So I think the key with anything that has any kind of negativity in your life, whether, people talk about failure all the time, there's a word that has huge, heaviness to it, right? And then people try to, turn it into lemonade and, oh, there's great learning and failure. Well, there is actually. And I've interviewed a ton of people who, will say that they are so glad that they failed over and over again because they really wouldn't be where they are now. And that they knew that without those failures, they wouldn't be where they are. So,
Yeah.
It's all in the eye of the beholder. It's not for any one of us to judge or to say what's good for one is not good for the other. But I think where people do get in their own way is when they're so busy trying to avoid making a mistake or avoid failure or not staying open and curious about what's possible, that they limit themselves to such an extent that they're not even discovering the best of themselves out there.
Yeah. That's a big mindset thing too, right?
Yeah.
And I'm speaking, I think, as somebody who has gone to the extremes of being of a fixed mindset at times and being of a growth mindset at times and saying, gosh, I failed at that job. I'm worthless at this. I should not be pursuing this. And it was other people's fault anyway. So, look, there's so many reasons why I'm just going to now curl back into my shell and go figure out what I need to do.
Yeah.
But really, to have taken that experience or those experiences, 'cause there's been more than one time, and say, all right, that didn't work out. Why didn't it work out? What could I have done differently? What should I have done differently? Or what should I be taking from that as, what positive things came out of that? How can I add that to my life? What gaps has it illustrated that I need to fill? Like there's any number of questions you can ask about it.
Yeah.
And I don't have all the answers to everything, of course, but
You don't?
To reflect and to think about it has really changed the way I look at things. I mean, and definitely not perfect about it. There are times where you do crawl back into your shell, I think, a little bit.
Well, but you catch yourself in those
But yeah.
moments, right? Like there's nothing wrong with going back into your shell. Sometimes you just need that. I have a good friend of mine was just describing something to me the other day. She said, I need a cave day. I'm like, what's a cave day? She said, it's a day when I just like lie on the couch and watch movies or something and don't make myself do anything. And I just need a cave day.
Yep.
Or maybe it's a day when you literally get into bed, put the cover over your head and say, you know what? I need a day where I just feel sorry for myself. The difference between that and, really falling into something deeper is quite different, right?
Yeah.
So, and what you're also talking about though is also having the tools to move out of that. So giving yourself, a day or two, or even sometimes people need more than that to just feel bad.
Yeah.
Is okay. That's human. It's when you start believing that that's the way things really are and have to be that way, that you're in trouble.
Yeah. And trauma of some kind or another certainly make that happen.
Sure.
A horrible experience at work can really do that.
Oh, absolutely. For sure. And I would bet that most people have had at least one work experience that leaves them feeling to some degree, some kind of trauma. I know I certainly have. And
I have.
Yeah. And it took me years to really feel like I was through it to some degree. Not that I wasn't able to move on, but I had one job where my old boss was fairly was somebody who would get interviewed on the news, and I would see her on the news every once in a while, and it would I'd have like a visceral reaction. I have to turn off the TV.
Yeah.
That was hard. I would have nightmares about her.
Imagine all the people out there who are having these either, I hope it's not outright trauma, but certainly negative experiences or, kind of moments that they wish they could relive and do differently or something involving another person. And then you have, social media.
Oh.
And you're seeing this person post all the time. I mean, let's not get into personal relationships where you see that's a typical, my ex is doing this. I see it online all the time. But I have any number of ex-colleagues, ex-bosses. I mean, thankfully, I feel like I'm in good relationship with the vast majority of them. But, there are some folks I will admit freely right now that when they post something and it's brilliant, because there normally is, this is brilliant people. They post something that's brilliant. I have a moment where I feel a little bit guilty
Yep.
and a little bit sad
Mm.
because I couldn't succeed working for that person.
Mm.
I don't feel bitter about the person,
Yeah.
like ever,
Yeah.
but I feel like, oh,
Well,
it's holding up a mirror.
You turn on yourself a little
I
bit.
turn on myself, yeah.
We all do that to some degree. And sometimes it's not even with somebody who we've ever worked with, but it could even be a colleague or someone we admire or we feel that we relate to. I mean, that's sort of the downside of social media.
Yeah.
And I think that there are times, and I know people who just take a break from it sometimes for that very reason, because you really do have to separate yourself from that. Again, another little brave self-disclosure there, Dan. I like that.
That's what I love about my podcast. It's my it's my therapy with the world.
Well, but I think it's also helpful for people to hear these things that we're talking about. I also think, in talking about things that have been traumatic from a workplace point of view, that some people, they do turn on themselves first and they think, what's wrong with me? Or why am I not stronger? All these sort of thoughts about what's wrong with them, when in fact, it's very human to have gone through having either a boss who's a bully or be in an organization where people really don't treat each other well. It's unfortunately more common than any of us would like to think. And it really can take a toll on you. And people will think that there's something wrong with them for not being able to handle it, or for having to quit their job over it, or for not being able to keep going in and feeling okay around it. And the fact is, these are toxic people or toxic environments, and nobody should be having to tolerate or put up with that. And I've worked with a number of people who think that they're supposed to overcome it. And the fact is, if it's that toxic, you probably should get out.
Yeah.
There's certain things that you can't necessarily change. And unfortunately, but it's not a comment on you. It's more of a comment on them.
Yeah.
And I hopefully somebody who's listening to this will hear that and realize it's not about you.
I really hope so too. And that's almost exactly what happened to me, by the way, once when I went to seek the counseling in one of my previous jobs. That's exactly what the counselor said. He said, look, the way that you're describing things, of course, taking me at my word, because there's a whole set of stories that were not told to the counselor. So, there's that. But understanding the perspective, he said, you have a couple choices here. I mean, but I will tell you from my experience that the situation you described from an organizational behavior standpoint is nearly impossible for you to change.
Yep.
The way that your team is set up, the way that your management is set up, you are set up to fail.
Yep.
Right? That's not to say you can't turn it around with a lot of hard work, but if is it worth the stress and the effort? That's something you have to ask yourself. So he didn't tell me, but it took me a long time to figure out that it wasn't me. It wasn't all me anyway,
Yeah. And it's hard.
And it makes you think about, am I in, is this a career that I should be pursuing? I mean, I got completely out of, I'm a marketing communications guy, right? It's what I've been doing for 20 years.
Yeah.
There was one point where I was like, fuck it, I've had enough.
Yeah.
I had to turn my back on it for a bit, and I went and did something completely different until a dear friend, he's a dear friend now, but at the time, somebody I didn't know very well, but knew enough, said to me, I have something for you. What are you doing? Why are you doing that other thing? You should be, you're clearly talented in this direction.
Yeah.
And, I guess that third-party validation really helped me to kind of come back to a particular track.
Yep.
And it was helpful to me.
Well, I think you're also pointing to something that I see a lot of, and that is that people get confused about when they are in a toxic work situation or just a
Mhm.
dysfunctional work situation. They start to lose sight of whether the career path they've chosen is the right one or
Yeah.
whether they're just in a bad work situation. And so they start to question everything. And hopefully they'll come to someone like me or someone like you
Oh.
and as a friend and say, I can't even tell the difference anymore. Maybe I picked the wrong field.
Mhm.
Chances are the choice is more that they've chosen the wrong company or the wrong group of people to work with, and they need a chance to figure that out. But they start questioning all the choices that they've made.
Mhm.
There's some research out there that shows that most people, when they leave a job, they're actually leaving a boss. It's not
Mhm.
the work itself that they're
Yeah.
leaving. And so it's just helpful to kind of have that perspective or to be able to unpack things that way and say, let me just take a look at what is it that I do day to day and how do I feel about that versus the kinds of interactions I'm having with people or the way we're expected to work together or the kinds of reporting relationships I have and things like that.
Yeah.
And when you start to unpack things that way, it helps to be able to see whether you're it's the situation you're in or whether you really are looking to change the kind of work you do or the industry you're in.
Yeah. It's taking that measured approach that I think most people don't do.
No, and they don't, some people don't even know that there's that kind of help out there. Some people think that it's not worth paying for.
Well,
And I nothing I can do about that. And and insurance won't pay for my services. Sorry. Um, people have asked me that. That's where you have to go see a therapist, but therapists aren't career coaches. So but there's lots of ways to look at, or you can go listen to some podcasts and maybe get some ideas. There are lots of different ways to get help to sort of start to unpack these things. But if you're really feeling that unhappy and that troubled, it definitely is important to try to talk to somebody who you trust
yeah.
to start to unpack things and figure out what you need to do and take some steps because it definitely takes time to find your way into something else. It's not
Yeah.
it's not an overnight process for most people.
I'm going to go out on a limb here and circle back a little bit and say that, when you're in that point in your, if you're ever in that point in your life or your career, and you probably have been many times, that's where you need to go and find that curiosity we were talking about
Mhm.
before.
Yep.
And, that, how can you spark that though? If you're so far, you know, if you're hard on yourself or you're so far, maybe, I guess if you're so far gone, maybe that falls in the realm of psychoanalysis. But let's say it's not that far gone, and you're just, you need to talk to somebody, or you
Yeah.
just could need some help.
Right.
How can you spark that creativity
Mm.
and its close cousin, creativity? I
Yeah.
mean, curiosity and its close cousin, creativity.
Right. Well, one thing that I do with people, and you can do this for yourself, is sort of ask yourself what's really at the root of this, what's really troubling me. Usually, there's some core values that are being stepped all over, and the things that most people talk to me about is I don't feel valued, I don't feel heard or seen. I mean, those are typical kinds of things. Or I don't like, or I feel disrespected. So then I say, okay, so tell me, what are you doing in the situation that might be contributing to that dynamic? Because I think a lot of people are very, and I don't say it to people so that they can be even harder on themselves than they already are. And I try to clarify it by saying, look, everything is a two-way street. There's no doubt about it that, for example, you are working in a dysfunctional organization. There's no leadership, or your boss is a bully, or your boss is abusive. There's no doubt about it. And honestly, if you could afford to, I'd tell you to get out of there today. However, I understand that you're a single parent with two children and you can't walk away right now. However, the game plan has to be that you get out of there as soon as possible. So let's talk about what are some other ways you can engage in this situation so that you're not feeling like you are dead to the world at the end of every day when you leave there. So we come up with other strategies. But what I also say is, look, everything's a two-way street. They're behaving a certain way, and there's something that you are doing that's also enabling that behavior to some degree. And so I know that you're not, because I think when people are in situations they're unhappy and they feel powerless. So we try to unpack it to the extent that we say, okay, so let's look at what you have control over and what you don't have control over. So what are the things you have control over? Let's start there.
Do you think that this has changed a little bit in the last year especially with COVID? And, by the time this podcast airs, I think that we're still going to be in the lockdown. I mean, I know that the vaccines are rolling out, everything like that, but the remote work situation is what it is, and it's probably going to continue to be that way.
Yeah.
I really kudos to employers who recognize this and are doing what they can to empower their employees to work remotely and feel a rewarding experience that way. But my point is, though, that if you are in that kind of a situation where you're in a toxic work environment or you have any kinds of number of problems at work, have you seen in your practice with your clients a sort of change in the way that they're able to cope or unable to cope with during the last year, especially as they're now all remote? Is there a big difference?
Yeah, I think there's one big difference. The clients of mine who have school-aged children at home, that's really very stressful and very difficult because they have a lot of things they have to figure out. And they're very torn between their work, helping their children deal with remote school or hybrid schedules. And some of my clients are looking for work while their kids are either home, and depending on how old their kids are. If their kids are on the younger side, I mean, I've been in the middle of meetings with clients where all of a sudden there'll be like a little head that shows up, peering into the screen, or it's especially funny around Halloween time. I saw a lot of costumes, or dogs barking or cats walking across the screen. These are the kinds of things a lot of people are seeing during COVID. But
of course,
there are a lot of distractions, let's say, a lot more distractions. Everybody has their own tolerance for all the adjustments they've had to make with working from home, setting up good workspaces at home, depending on who they're at home with. And so these are the kinds of things that, while people have found the best ways possible to make it work, everybody's situation is different. And I haven't seen that it's particularly easy for just about anybody. I'd say for me personally, it's been not that difficult. And even for me, there's been some challenges for some period of time when I had my 26-year-old daughter here for 6 months, and my husband's working from home now. And I was accustomed to being the only one home during the day because I work from home. So I had to make adjustments, but I wouldn't say that it's been, it's been so hard when I see what other people are going through. So I'm not breaking out any violins for me, but I would say for my clients, and what's also interesting though, is that there was about a 2-month period where I had about 5 clients who all got new jobs in the middle of all of this. And yet everybody was saying, oh, it's a terrible time to get a new job. And some of them got jobs in industries that you wouldn't even expect they would get jobs in during this time, because those were fields that have really been kind of hurting right now. So that to me comes under the category of, don't assume anything. Anything is possible. If you want to operate on the assumption that this is going to be difficult, it will be difficult. If you want to assume that certain things are not possible, it will not be possible. If you want to go forward and assume or expect that there may be possibilities, I say go that way, because there's so many other people who are assuming it's not possible. The field might be a little thinner and you might have a better chance.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying, I've had plenty of clients getting brand new jobs right now and getting salary increases and
Yeah.
promotions and all kinds of things. So I would not, and I can't say, oh, I'm such a great coach that they're getting all these things. I think I've been helpful to them, no doubt.
Mhm.
But I will say that there's something that's still happening out there. So don't
Yeah.
assume that the world has come to an end.
Well,
But it is definitely stressful and challenging. But I think there's also been a way in which there's a certain kind of stillness and quietness too
mhm.
that has enabled people to focus in certain ways.
That is very reflective of my experience
Hmm.
over the last year for sure. And yeah, look, I mean, by the time this show comes out, it will be known. It'll certainly be on my LinkedIn profile that I too have been able to change jobs during the whole COVID thing. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing.
Oh,
I mean, an amazing story. And I have nothing but the best feelings for my current employer and for my next employer. I mean, it is my next employer who is at the time of this airing my current employer. so but my former, my current, however you want to call it. The point is that I moved from one company to another. Just the opportunity called, and I had to answer it. And I didn't necessarily have the intention of doing that. I was, you know, relatively satisfied in my role. I mean, but I'm one of the very, very fortunate ones that
yeah.
just probably saw that this world is there's new opportunities in this world. And one of the things though that I think made that happen and that I found to be the case is that with the sudden change in the workforce, and it was very sudden, the shift to being, okay, guess what? You're not traveling anymore. You're not coming to an office anymore. You're now at home or at a Starbucks. Well, not even that anymore, but you're working remotely, left to your own devices to a degree. I think a lot of people, either panicked or said, okay, I have to figure out how to make this work, which I think the vast majority of humans do. Necessity is the mother of invention, right?
Hmm.
You live up to the up at least to the minimum expectations that are set in front of you, and
Hmm.
with all this time to be reflective
Yeah.
and to see that I'm losing my coping mechanisms. Okay, I'm losing the ability to talk to my workmate to say, hey, let's go out for a quick drink, or let's go to the company
Right.
cafeteria, whatever it is, or go to their desk when you're feeling a little bit. You can't do that.
Right.
So you turn to yourself. And what happens? You look to ways to fix the situation on your own. And to me, that evolved or developed into this kind of creative explosion.
Mm.
Like I had all these energies, I had some frustrations and some kind of things. What am I going to do? And I started doing things like, well, you know what? I'm going to write. I'm going to journal. Journaling has been a tremendous boon
Mm.
and a great way to cope with the questions I'm asking
Yeah.
myself. And then the podcast happened.
Yeah.
And the podcast, as I even said earlier, sometimes it's just like therapy with the world. I think it's fantastic, but that's just my way,
Yeah.
you know?
It's interesting. And then I think about the people whose lives have required them to go out and continue to work out in the world.
Yep.
Healthcare workers, public servants. I'm thinking about,
Kudos to all of them.
I'm
Yep.
thinking about people who work in public transit or
Mhm.
trash collectors or,
Yeah.
people who deliver our mail. And even those folks who have to be out and about for their jobs, their lives have changed too. It's not the
Yeah.
same, even though they're doing the same job and they're leaving their homes every day. They have to do things differently. They're interacting with the world differently. I know for the people in healthcare, it's been enormously stressful, and that's an understatement. And
Yeah.
so for them, the kind of reflection that they've been able to do is probably somewhat different than for those of us who work from home.
Yeah,
But I
I
can
agree.
imagine that there still is an element of reflectiveness that each of us gets to do during this time, because there's been a premium put on life that none of us has ever encountered before.
Yeah.
Unless you're just one of these people who's just sitting around feeling sorry for yourself all the time and saying, I can't wait till this is over, which would be kind of tiresome after a while. My feeling is you might as well use the time to do something for yourself or for
Yeah.
someone else, but not everybody thinks that way.
Yeah. It's hard to, figure out, or even sometimes again, it goes back to self-awareness a little bit to say, look, I'm in a funk.
Hmm.
It's a bad time right now
Yeah,
for many, many reasons. I'm either just going to blame it on the world around me and say, okay, I can't leave my house, poor me, or I'm going to do something about it.
yeah,
Then again, there are plenty of folks out there who are not nearly as fortunate as
right,
those of us who've managed to keep jobs and
right,
and work remotely. I mean, hey, prayers to the restaurant workers and
yeah,
to, folks whose lives have changed and been upended in ways that I can't even imagine.
right.
I definitely feel for them. And I hope to be able to do more for those people as I go along. But I think you're right. It's just it would be a little bit tiresome, might be the right word, to sit around all for this whole year and be saying, when I can't wait for this to end. I'm going to feel sorry for myself the whole
Yeah,
time.
yeah.
You know,
Especially if you have the benefit of a roof over your head and food on the table. I
yeah,
think, like you're pointing out, we've got entire industries that have been decimated by this.
yeah,
There are entire workforces that have really, really been hit really hard. And, my hope is that some of them have some good family structures or circles of support that have been able to help them. But
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, and there's people like you, Tammy, just great coaches and folks who are there to help with those who are struggling in their role. And we are at that point in the show where I can't believe that so much time has passed, but sadly we have to wrap it up soon. I've loved this conversation, Tammy. I think this has been really meaningful,
mm.
honestly. And I want to be very clear that Tammy and I have had some very, very gut laughing conversations apart from this, although this has been kind of serious. But
Yeah.
look, I suggest, I really recommend people to go and listen to Tammy's podcast. You can go to tammygoolerloeb.com and you'll see the way that her name is spelled by the title of this episode. But how else can people find you, Tammy? And how can they find the podcast?
Well, going to my website, tammygoolerloeb.com, is the best way to find me and everything about me. I mean, I'm on all kinds of social media, but nobody has my name. So if you type in my name or some semblance of it, you will find me.
Yeah.
There's no doubt about it. Work from the Inside Out is the podcast, and it's easy enough to find me. And in the
Yep.
coming months, I'll be probably adding some pages and materials to my website about the book. And
Yeah. And oh, hey, how about mentioning your book a little bit, Tammy? I think
yeah,
our listeners are going to want to hopefully grab a copy.
I hope so. That's my hope. I've been having so much fun. In fact, I planned on writing the book before the pandemic hit, and then the pandemic just provided some space for me to do some writing that I never would have anticipated. But the book is called Your Career is an Inside Job,
Mm.
Moving Beyond the Butts to Carve a Path that Fulfills You.
Moving beyond the butts
The
to carve
butts
a
in
path.
quotes. So the butts is in quotes, because when I first said that to somebody, they started giggling like a middle schooler.
It is a little giggle worthy.
It is a little giggle worthy. I know it reads better than it sounds. So,
It sounds great and it reads great. I mean, I think it works both ways.
but basically,
Mhm.
trying to dispel a lot of the barriers that get in the way of people making the moves that will make for a more meaningful or fulfilling career or work life, and telling lots of really cool stories of really wonderful people who have really moved beyond the butts to get to do some really interesting things. So it's really a lot of interesting stories that set really good examples, so that hopefully people will read it and say, hey, I could do that too. And then at the end of each chapter, there's some good, powerful questions that get people thinking reflectively and hopefully get them moving into some action for themselves.
Well, I think it's a phenomenal project. Congratulations on finishing the manuscript.
Thank
And
you.
I know it's going to be a big deal when it comes out. So,
Yeah.
not like I'm kind of trying to, you know, get an advance copy signed or anything like that. But I'm just saying,
Well,
um,
there might be one if you give me your address. I mean, it's coming
I,
out in May, so
yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It sounds like a great read, and I love books that are like, that have our series of stories that are
yeah,
based on stories and that draw the knowledge from real experiences and
yeah.
real people. Makes them very interesting to read. So you're here to hear first, or maybe not first, but you definitely heard it
No,
here.
this is the
That
first. Yes, this is my premiere announcement,
well,
actually.
by the time it comes out, I don't know about that, but at least between us right now, this is a great thing that we're looking forward to, and I'm very happy that you were able to talk about it here. So, Tammy, any last words? Anything you want to say before we wrap it up?
Well, I think I want to say to people, stay open and curious. So when you find yourself feeling the limitations, notice them, don't judge them, and remind yourself to just ask yourself, what would it look like if? And think about
Love it.
what the other possibilities are.
What would it look like if? Stay open and curious.
Mm-hmm.
Words to live by. Thanks so much for joining me today, Tammy. It's been a pleasure to talk.
Thank you, Dan. It's been wonderful.
If you enjoyed this episode of The Dan Nessel Show, please head on over to iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or the podcast player of your choice to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. And please don't forget to spread the word. Thanks for listening.